Next up, Taylor Owen. On deck, Ben Scott. So go ahead.
Thank you. Co-Chair Zimmer and Collins and committee members. Thank you for having me. I have to say it's a real honor to be here with you and amongst these other panelists. I'm particularly heartened, though, because even 3 years ago, I think a meeting like this would have seemed unnecessary to many in the public, the media, the technology sector, and by governments themselves. But now I would suggest we're in an entirely different policy moment, about which I want to make 5 observations about this policy space we're in right now. The first point I want to make is that it's pretty clear that self-regulation and even many of the forms of co-regulation that are being discussed have and will continue to prove insufficient for this problem. The financial incentives are simply powerfully aligned against meaningful reform. These are publicly traded, largely unregulated companies whose shareholders and directors expect growth by maximizing a revenue model that is itself part of the problem. This growth may or may not be aligned with the public interest. Second point I want to make is this problem is not one of bad actors, but one of structure. Disinformation, hate speech, election interference, privacy breaches, mental health issues, and anti-competitive behavior must be treated as symptoms of the problem, not its cause. Public policy should therefore focus on the design and the incentives embedded in the design of the platforms themselves. It is the design of the attention economy which incentivizes virality and engagement over reliable information. It is the design of the financial model of surveillance capitalism, which we'll hear much more about, which incentivizes data accumulation and its use to influence our behavior. It is the design of group messaging, which allows for harmful speech, even the incitement of violence, to spread without scrutiny. It is a design for global scale that is incentivized imperfect automation solutions to content filtering, moderation, and fact-checking, and is the design of our unregulated digital economy that has allowed our public sphere to become monopolized. If democratic governments determine that this structure and this design is leading to negative social and economic outcomes, as I would argue it is, then it is their responsibility to govern. So the third point I would make is that governments that are taking this problem seriously, many of which are included here, are all converging, I think, on a markedly similar platform governance agenda. This agenda recognizes that there are no silver bullets to this broad set of problems we're talking about, and that instead policies must be domestically implemented and internationally coordinated across 3 categories, I think. Content policies, which seek to address a wide range of both supply and demand issues about the nature, amplification, and legality of content in our digital public sphere. Data policies, which ensure that public data is used for the public good and that citizens have far greater rights over the use, mobility, and monetization of their data. And competition policies, which promote free and competitive markets in the digital economy. So that's the platform governance agenda. The fourth point I want to make is that the propensity when discussing this agenda to overcomplicate solutions serves the interests of the status quo. There are actually many, I think, sensible policies that could and should be implemented immediately. The online ad micro-targeting market could be made radically more transparent, in many cases suspended entirely. Data privacy regimes could be updated to provide far greater rights to individuals and greater oversight and regulatory power to punish abuses. Tax policy can be modernized to better reflect the consumption of digital goods and to crack down on tax base erosion and profit sharing. Modernized competition policy can be used to restrict and roll back acquisitions and to separate platform ownership from application and product development. Civic media can be supported as a public good, and large-scale and long-term civic literacy and critical thinking efforts can be funded at scale by national governments, not by private organizations. That few of these have been implemented is a problem of political will, not of policy or technical complexity. Finally, though, and the fifth point I want to make is that there are policy questions for which there are neither easy solutions, meaningful consensus, nor appropriate existing international institutions, and where there may be irreconcilable tensions between the design of the platforms and the objectives of public policy. The first is how we regulate harmful speech in the digital public sphere. At the moment, we've largely outsourced the application of national laws, as well as the interpretation of difficult trade-offs between free speech and personal and public harms to the platforms themselves. Companies who seek solutions, rightly in their perspective, that can be implemented at scale globally. In this case, I would argue what is possible technically and financially for the companies might be insufficient for the goals of the public good or the public policy goals. The second is who's liable for content online. We've clearly moved beyond the notion of platform neutrality and absolute safe harbor. But what legal mechanisms are best suited to holding platforms, their design, and those that run them accountable? And finally, as artificial intelligence increasingly shapes the character and economy of our digital public sphere, how are we going to bring these opaque systems into our laws and norms and regulations? These difficult conversations, as opposed to the what I think are the easier policies that can be implemented, should not be outsourced, in my view, to the private sector. They need to be led by democratically accountable governments and their citizens. But this is going to require political will and policy leadership, precisely what I think this committee represents. Thank you very much.
Mr. Scott. Next up, Heidi Tworek, and on deck, Ms. Zuboff. So go ahead, Ms. Tworek.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the distinguished members of the International Grand Committee for the kind invitation to speak before you today. It's really an honour to support international cooperation in this form. So in my work, I wear two hats. I'm a historian and I analyse policy. Now, I know wearing two hats is a bit of a strange fashion choice, but in fact, I think it can help to lead us to much more robust solutions that can stand the test of time. So in my policy work, I've written about hate speech and disinformation in Canada, the United States, and in Europe. I'm a member of the steering committee of the Transatlantic High-Level Working Group on Content Moderation Online and Freedom of Expression. Wearing my history hat, I've been working for nearly a decade on the history of media, and I just finished this book, which is called News from Germany, The Competition and Control World Communications, 1900 to 1945. And amongst other things in this book, I detail how it is that Germany's vibrant interwar media democracy descended into an authoritarian Nazi regime that could spread anti-Semitic, racist, and homophobic propaganda around the world. While I was writing this book, the present caught up with history in all sorts of frankly disturbing ways. The far right around the world revived Nazi terminology, using Lügenpresse, lying press, or Systempresse, system press, to decry the media. Marginalized groups were targeted online. They were blamed for societal ills that they did not cause. News was falsified for political and economic purposes. Like with radio in the first half of the 20th century, a technology designed with utopian aims became a tool for dictators and demagogues. Now, some aspects of the internet, as our other witnesses have described, they are unprecedented. The micro-targeting, the scale, the machine learning, the granular level of surveillance. But some of the underlying patterns look surprisingly familiar to the historians among us. So what I'm going to do then is just offer 5 brief lessons from this history that I think can guide our policy discussions in the future and enable us to build robust solutions that can make our democracies stronger rather than weaker. The first lesson is that disinformation is also an international relations problem. Information warfare has been a feature, not a bug, of the international system for at least a century. So the question is not if information warfare exists, but why and when states engage in it. And what we see is that it's often when a state feels encircled, weak, or aspires to become a greater power than it already is. This is as true for Germany 100 years ago as it is for Russia today. So if many of the causes of disinformation are geopolitical, we need to remember that many of the solutions will be geopolitical and diplomatic as well. Second, we need to pay attention to the physical infrastructure of what is happening. Information warfare, disinformation is also enabled by physical infrastructure, whether submarine cables a century ago or fiber optic cables today. One of Britain's first acts of war in World War I was to cut the cables that connected Germany to the rest of the world, pushing Germany to invest in a new communications technology, radio, that by the time the Nazis came to power, one American radio executive would call the most potent political agency the world had ever known. Now, we often think of the internet as wireless, but that's fundamentally untrue. 95 to 99% of international data flows through undersea fiber optic cables. Google partly owns 8.5% of those submarine cables. Content providers also own physical infrastructure. Now, sometimes those cables get disrupted because they get bitten through by sharks, but states can bite too. And we do know that Russia and China, for example, are surveying European and North American cables. China, we know, is, of course, investing in 5G, but combining that in ways that Germany did as well, with investments in international news networks like the Belt and Road News Network, English language TV channels like CGTN, or the Chinese news agency Xinhua. Third, as many of the other witnesses have said, we need to think about business models much more than individual pieces of content. It's very tempting to focus on examples of individual content that's particularly harmful. But the reason that those pieces of content go viral is because of the few companies that control the bottleneck of information. Only 29% of Americans or Brits understand that their Facebook newsfeed is algorithmically organized. The most aware are the Finns, and there only 39% of them understand that. That invisibility accords social media platforms an enormous amount of power. That power is not neutral. At a very minimum, we need far more transparency about how algorithms work, whether they are discriminatory, and so on and so forth. Because as we strive towards evidence-based policy, we need good evidence. Fourth, we need to be careful to design robust regulatory institutions. And here the case of Germany in the interwar period offers a cautionary tale. Spoken radio emerged in the 1920s. Bureaucrats in the democratic Weimar Republic wanted to ensure that radio would bolster democracy in a very, very new democracy after World War I. As that democracy became more and more politically unstable, those bureaucrats continually instituted reforms that created more and more state supervision of content. And the idea here was to protect democracy by preventing news from spreading that would provoke violence. The deep irony of this story is that the minute the Nazis came to power, they controlled radio. So well-intentioned regulation, if we're not careful, can have tragic, unintended consequences. So what does that mean for today? It means we have to democracy-proof whatever the solutions are that we come up with. We need to make sure that we embed civil society in whatever institutions we create. So one suggestion that I've made with Fenwick McKelvey and Chris Tenove is the idea of social media councils that would be multi-stakeholder fora and that could meet regularly to actually deal with many of the problems that we're describing. The exact format, geographical scope, they're still up for debate, but it's an idea supported by many, including the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and opinion. Fifth, we need to make sure that we still pay attention to and address the societal divisions exploited by social media. The seeds of authoritarianism need fertile soil to grow. And if we do not attend to the underlying economic and social discontents, better communications cannot obscure those problems forever. So let me then remind you of these 5 lessons. First, disinformation is also an international relations problem. Second, we need to pay attention to physical infrastructure. Third, business models matter more than individual pieces of content. Fourth, we need to build robust regulatory institutions. And fifth, we must pay attention to those societal divisions that are exploited on social media. In attending to all of these things, there is no way it can be done within any one nation. It must be done also through international cooperation. That's why it's such a great honor to have had the chance to appear before you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Tworek. Next up.